Book 3, Modern Philosophy, From Renaissance to Hume. Many histories of philosophy exist, and it has not been my purpose to add one to their number. My purpose is to exhibit philosophy as an integral part of social and political life, not as the isolated speculations of remarkable individuals, but as both an effect and a cause of the character of the various communities in which different systems flourished. The great age of the scholastic philosophy was an outcome of the reforms of the 11th century, and these in turn were a reaction against previous corruption. Without some knowledge of the centuries between the fall of Rome and the rise of the medieval papacy, the intellectual atmosphere of the 12th and 13th centuries can hardly be understood. In dealing with this period as with others, I have aimed at giving only so much general history as I thought necessary for the comprehension of philosophers in relation to the times that formed them and the times that they helped to form. Every pure man of action are sometimes of great importance in this respect. Very few philosophers have influenced philosophy as much as Alexander the Great or Napoleon. Philosophy, as I shall understand the word, is sometime intermediate between theology and science. Science tells us what we can know, but what we can know is little. And if we forget how much we cannot know, we become insensitive to many things of great importance. During the period of darkness from the end of the 5th century to the middle of the 11th, the Western world underwent some very interesting changes. The conflict between duty to God and duty to the state, while Christianity had introduced, took the form of conflict between church and king. This political disorder found expression in Machiavelli's Prince. In the absence of any guiding principle, politics becomes a naked struggle for power. The prince gives shrewd advice as to how to play this game successfully. The Catholic Church was derived from three sources. Its history was Jewish, its theology was Greek, its government and canon laws, at least indirectly Roman. The rise of Greek civilization. What they achieved in art and literature is familiar to everybody, but what they did in the purely intellectual realm is even more exceptional. They invented mathematics and science and philosophy. The art of writing was invented in Egypt about the year 4000 BC and in Babylon. The early development of civilization in Egypt was due to the Nile, the Tigris, which made agriculture very easy and very productive. Egypt influenced Greece. The main facts of the trial of Socrates are not open to doubt. The persecution was based upon the charge that Socrates is an evildoer and a curious person, searching into things under the earth and above the heaven, and making the worse appears the better cause, and teaching all this to others. One morning, Socrates was thinking about something which he could not resolve. He would not give it up, but continued thinking from early dawn until noon. Then Socrates stood fixed in thought, and at noon attention was drawn to him, and the rumor ran through the wondering crowd that Socrates had been standing and thinking about something ever since the break of the day. At last, in the evening after supper, some Ionians, out of curiosity, brought out their mats and slept in the open air that they might watch him and see whether he would stand all night. Then he stood until the following morning, and with the return of the light, he offered up a prayer to the sun and went his way. Socrates' endurance was simply marvelous. When, being cut off from our supplies, we were compelled to go without food on such occasions, which often happens in time of war. He was superior not only to me but to everybody. There was no one to be compared to him. His fortitude in enduring cold was also surprising. There was a severe frost, for the winter in that region is really tremendous, and everybody else either remained indoors or if they went out had an amazing quantity of clothes and were well shod and had their feet swathed in felt and fleeces. In the midst of this, Socrates, with his bare feet on the ice and in his ordinary dress, marched better than the other soldiers who had shoes. Socrates' mastery over all bodily passions is constantly stressed. He seldom drank wine, but when he did, he could outdrink anybody. No one had ever seen him drunk. The close connection between virtue and knowledge is characteristics of Socrates and Plato. Plato, or Aflatun, and Aristotle were the most influential of all philosophers, ancient, medieval, or modern. And of the two, it was Plato who had the greater effect upon subsequent ages. Plato, or Aflatun, was born in 428 BC. He was a pupil of Socrates, for whom he had a profound affection and respect. And Socrates was put to death by the democracy. The good dominated his thought. Much education is needed to make a good ruler on Plato's principle. Wisdom possession is supposed to make a man capable of governing wisely. Culture is to be devoted to making men gentlemen. What is a philosopher? A philosopher is a lover of wisdom. The man who only loves beautiful things is dreaming, whereas the man who knows absolute beauty is wide awake. The former has only opinion, the latter has knowledge. Philosophy is the vision of truth. Aristotle thought of Alexander as that idle and headstrong boy who never could understand anything of philosophy. On the whole, the contacts of these two great men seems to have been as unfruitful as if they had lived in different worlds. Aristotle is no believer in equality. Granted, however, the subjections of slaves and women it still remains a question whether all citizens should be politically equal. The mind is its own place, and it itself can make a heaven of hell, a hell of heaven. Philosophers are usually men with a certain breadth of mind. The Roman Empire was on the whole stable and peaceful for over 200 years, from the exactions of Augustus 30 BC until the disasters of the 3rd century. Two things had ruined the Greek political system. First, the claim of each city to absolute sovereignty. Second, the bitter and bloody strife between rich and poor within most cities. Constantine's most important innovation was the adoption of Christianity as the state religion, apparently because a large proportion of the soldiers were Christians. Greek felt himself more civilized, but politically less powerful. The Greeks were superior in manufacturing and agriculture and the kind of knowledge that are necessary for a good officials. The only things in which Romans were superior were military tactics and social cohesion. Again, a philosophy may be important because it expresses well what men are prone to believe in certain moods or in certain circumstances. Catholic philosophy is that which dominated European thought from Augustine to the Renaissance. Catholic philosophy is essentially the philosophy of an institution, namely the Catholic Church. The most important Jewish elements in Christianity appear to me are following: a sacred history beginning with the creation, leading to the consummation in the future, and justifying the ways of God to man. The existence of a small section of mankind whom God especially loves. For Jews, this section was the chosen people. A new conception of righteousness. Messiah. The Jews believe that the Messiah would bring them temporal prosperity and victory over their enemies here on earth. Moreover, he remained in the future. For Christians, the Messiah was the historical Jesus, who was also identified with logos of Greek philosophy. Four men are called the doctors of the Western Church: Saint Ambrose, Saint Jerome, Saint Augustine, and Pope Gregory of the Great. Christians put the church in place of the chosen people. Saint Augustine maintains that the world was created not from any creation matter, but from nothing. God created substance, not only ordered and arrangement. Why was the world not created sooner? Because there was no sooner. Time was created when the world was created. God is eternal in the sense of being timeless. In God, there is no before and after, but only an eternal present. What then is time? He asks. If no one asks of me, I know, I wish to explain to him who asks, I not. Neither past nor future, he says, but only the present really is. The present is only a moment, and time can only be measured while it is passing. The world is less than 6,000 years old. History is not cyclic, as some philosophers suppose. Christ died once for our sins. This leads to a long and minute discussion of sexual lust, to which we are subject as part of our punishment for Adam's sins. It must be admitted that sexual intercourse in marriage is not sinful, provided the intention is to beget offspring. Saint Augustine taught that Adam, before the fall, had free will and could have abstained from sin. But as he and Eve ate the apple, corruption entered into them. The 5th and 6th centuries was that of barbarian invasion and the fall of the Western Empire. After the death of Augustine in 430, there was little philosophy. It was a century of destructive action. Rome was 5 times captured, thrice by Byzantines, twice by Goths. In 568, Italy was invaded by a new and very fierce German tribe, the Lombards. Wars between them and the Byzantines continued intermittently for 200 years. Cleanliness was viewed with abhorrence. Lies were called pearls of God and were a mark of saintliness. Saints, male and female, would boast that water had never touched their feet except when they had to cross rivers. Most monks did not work, never read anything except what religion prescribed. In the 7th century, Rome was still subject to the military power of the emperors, and popes had to obey or suffer. When priests were married, they naturally tried to pass on church property to their sons. They could do this legally if their sons became priests. Mohammedan culture and philosophy. The Hijrah with which Mohammedan era began took place in AD 622. Muhammad died 10 years later. Immediately after his death, the Arab conquest began, and they proceeded with extraordinary rapidity. In the east, Syria was invaded in 634. In 637, Persia was invaded. Constantinople was besieged in 699. The religion of the Prophet Muhammad was a simple monotheism, uncomplicated by the elaborate theology of right, Trinity, and the Incarnation. The Prophet made no claims to be divine, nor did his followers make such a claim on his behalf. He revived the Jewish prohibition of graven images and forbade the use of wine. Arabia was largely desert and was growing less and less capable of supporting its population. Under the early Abbasids, the caliphate attained its greatest splendor. The best known of them is Harun al-Rashid, 809. The political and social system of the Arabs had defects similar to those of the Roman Empire. The distinctive culture of the Muslim world, though it began in Syria, soon came to flourish most in the eastern and western extremities, Persia and Spain. The Syrians at the time of conquest were admirers of Aristotle. Persian civilization remained both intellectually and artistically admirable until the invasion of the Mongols in the 13th century, from which it never recovered. Umar Khayyam, the only man known to me who was both a poet and a mathematician, two Mohammedan philosophers, one of Persia, one of Spain, demand special notice. They are Avicenna and Averroes. Of these, the former is the famous among Mohammedan, the latter among Christians. Averroes, like most of the later Mohammedan philosophers, though a believer, was not rigidly orthodox. There was a sect of completely orthodox theologians who objected to all philosophy. One of these, named Al-Ghazal, wrote a book called The Destruction of Philosophers, pointing out that since all necessary truth is in the Quran, there is no need of speculation independent of revelation. Averroes replied by a book called Destruction of the Destruction. Averroes is more important in Christian than in Mohammedan philosophy. In the latter, he was a dead end. In the former, a beginning. Averroes was translated into Latin early in the 13th century by Michael Scott. His influence in Europe was very great. Arabic philosophy is not important as original thought. Men like Avicenna and Averroes are essentially commentators. Speaking generally, the views of the more scientific philosophers come from Aristotle. Writers in Arabic showed some originality in mathematics and in the chemistry. Saint Thomas Aquinas is regarded as one of the greatest scholastic philosophers during the time 1225 to 1274. In most respects, he follows Aristotle. St. Augustine had a really competent knowledge of Aristotle. God is good, and his own goodness, he is the good of every good. God is intelligent, and his act of intelligence, his essence. He understands by his essence and understands himself perfectly. God knows things that don't yet exist. Dante, 1265 to 1321, though as a poet, he was a great innovator, was, as a thinker, somewhat behind the times. The Renaissance was not a period of great achievement in philosophy, but it did certain things. The Renaissance was not a popular movement. It was a movement of a small number of scholars and artists. It produced very great men such as Leonardo, Michelangelo, and Machiavelli. It liberated educated men from the narrowness of medieval culture, and even while still a slave to the worship of antiquity, it made scholars aware that a variety of opinions had been held by reputable authorities on almost every subject. The Renaissance, though it produced no important theoretical philosopher, produced one man of supreme eminence in political philosophy, Machiavelli. Such intellectual honesty about political dishonesty would have been hardly possible at any other time or in any other country. Machiavelli remarks that all armed prophet have conquered and unarmed failed. A ruler will perish if he is always good. He must be as cunning as a fox and fierce as a lion. He goes on to say that, above all, a prince should seem to be religious. The question is ultimately one of power. To achieve a political end, power of one kind or another is necessary. If the side that you think right prevails, that is because it has superior power. It is true that power often depends upon opinion and opinion upon propaganda. For this reason, it may sometimes happen that victory goes to the side which has the most of what the general public considers to be virtue. We must concede to Machiavelli that this was an important element in the growing power of the church during the 11th, 12th, and 13th centuries, as well as in the success of the Reformation in the 16th century. The rise of science. Almost everything that distinguishes the modern world from early centuries is attributed to science, which achieves its most spectacular triumphs in the 17th century. The new conception that science introduced profoundly influenced modern philosophy. Descartes, who was in a sense the founder of modern philosophy, was himself one of the creators of 17th century science. Four great men, Copernicus, Kepler, Galileo, and Newton, are preeminent in the creation of science. Galileo, 1564 to 1642, is the greatest of the founders of modern science, with the possible exception of Newton. Galileo first discovered the importance of acceleration in dynamics. Acceleration means change of velocity, whether in magnitude or direction. Galileo, as everyone knows, was condemned, first privately in 1616 and then publicly in 1633. Newton, 1647 to 1727, achieved the final and complete triumph. He proved three laws. The 17th century was remarkable not only in astronomy and dynamics, but in many ways connected with science. The compound microscope was invented. The telescope was invented in 1608. The consequence of this scientific work we have been considering was that the outlook of educated men was completely transformed. Francis Bacon, 1561 to 1626, was the pioneer in the attempt of logical systemization of scientific procedure. Bacon's most important book, The Advancement of Learning, Knowledge is Power, Hobbes was an admirer of mathematical model, not only in pure mathematics but in its application. Hobbes considers the question why men cannot cooperate like ants and bees. Bees in the same hives, he says, don't compete. They have no desire for honor, and they don't use reason to criticize the government. Their agreement is natural, but that of man can only be artificial. Descartes, 1596 to 1650, is usually considered the founder of modern philosophy. Descartes had a daughter who died at the age of 5. This was, he said, the greatest sorrow of his life. His great contribution to geometry was the invention of coordinate geometry. Spinoza, 1634 to 1677, is the noblest and most lovable of the great philosophers. He was born a Jew, but the Jews excommunicated him. Christians abhorred him equally. The life of Spinoza was very simple. His family had come to Holland from Spain. He himself was educated in Jewish learning, but found it impossible to remain orthodox. His wants were few and simple, and he showed throughout his life a rare indifference to money. The few who know him loved him, even if they disapproved of his principles. There is no such thing as free will in the mental sphere or chance in the physical world. Everything that happens is a manifestation of God's nature, and it is logically impossible that events should be other than they are. Spinoza's outlook is intended to liberate man from the tyranny of fear. A free man thinks of nothing less than of death, and his wisdom is meditation not of death but of life. Spinoza thinks that if you see your misfortunes as they are in reality, as part of the concatenation of causes stretching from the beginning of time to the end, you will see that they are only misfortunes to you, not to the universe. Each act of cruelty is eternally a part of the universe. Nothing that happens later can make that act good rather than bad, or can confer perfection on the whole of which it is a part. John Locke, 1637 to 1704, is the apostle of the Revolution of 1688, the most moderate and the most successful of all revolutions. Locke is the most fortunate of all philosophers. He completed his work in theoretical philosophy just at the moment when the government of his country fell into the hands of men who shared his political opinion. His political doctrine are embedded in the American Constitution, the British Constitution, and his influence in 18th century France, which was immense, was primarily due to the Voltaire, who was a young man who spent time in England and interpreted English ideas in his book. Property is very prominent in Locke's political philosophy and is, according to him, the chief reason for the institution of civil government. The other main type of theory of which Locke is representative maintained that civil government is the result of a contract and is an affair purely of this world, not something established by divine authority. It is surprising that Locke says nothing about the judiciary, although this was a burning question in his days.